I would like to clarify one thing. I didn't go to Atlanta. I went to Charlotte, North Carolina. And that's actually where I met Anthony Fox when he was the mayor. And then he went on to become the Secretary of Transportation. And he called me one day and said, "Do you know some good people?" So I'm texting him all these names, and then it finally said, "What about me?" And he said, "Well, that's what I was trying to get to." So anyway, so here we are in Philadelphia, and talking about what transit is today. And so I just wanted to talk about some of the transformation that we're seeing going on in the transit industry. And I think you've all seen, just a host of headlines about, is transit viable now? Is transit dead? And so I want to talk about what is going on from my perspective in the industry. Last week I went to Vancouver, Canada for the Canadian Urban Transportation Association's Mobility Symposium. And for the American Public Transportation Association, I'm the co-chair of their upcoming Mobility Summit. And so we're talking about all of the things that are transpiring in the industry today, and that's what I want to talk about in my time with you today. See if I get the clicker. So here we are, beautiful Philadelphia skyline, but we're out here in the suburbs, and so the challenges for providing transportation are really on a regional basis. Philadelphia is the hub of your region. And it's the main destination for employment. It's the main destination for business and entertainment. But as we've seen the changes in this country, we see that population is becoming more dispersed around our regional hubs, and that we are seeing that the core is being served by traditional transportation. But when you get into the outlying and suburban areas, there's more challenges, and those are the things that we have to address from the planning perspective as well as from the delivery perspective. And so transit cannot effectively serve everything. Transit is not a one-size solution. And so what we have to look at is how we plan for the future and how we plan to make sure that there's connectivity and equity and sustainability. So the question in the headlines these days is transit dead? And as Tim was talking about the Koch brothers article yesterday, that circulated throughout the industry yesterday. I can't tell you how many emails that I got from people who aren't in the transit industry but know that I'm working in the transit industry and who are worried about my job. And so we're all sitting here looking at this article, and there's a lot of lessons learned. And so I say, no, transit is not dead. But what does it provide? It's still a vital need in our communities. It's still part of the fabric of what economic development is in those communities, and the direction that we need to go in terms of providing an alternative to the personal car and an option for those who have no cars or don't want to drive. So, does public transit serve a public good? I say yes, and these are the benefits that it provides. As Tim was saying, and looking at the mission of TMAC, we really need to look at the public benefits, the equity, and the sustainability. Those are the primary benefits that we get from public transit. And I would add economic benefit too, because if you look at transit-oriented development, if you look at the benefits that public transit brings, you will see that. When I was in Charlotte, the light rail system that was built generated initially about $1.8 billion in development along that line. And that benefit did not come back as value capture to public transit, that benefit actually went into the general fund of the city and actually paid for education, police, and other public safety. And so whether it's a direct benefit or an indirect benefit, transit definitely provides viability. So, what is the intrinsic value of transit? And in my presentation today, most of what I'm asking are questions so that we can think about, what is the intersection of transit, economic development, and planning in the future. So we're entering an era of shared economy. And so the questions have been raised about, whether, transit and the Ubers, the transportation network companies, can actually exist together. And so there are a number of benefits for public transit, and public transit will continue to be the backbone. And in dense urban areas, it's going to be, part of the fabric that will continue. And, so during peak commutes, public transit provides a reliable commute. There are some issues sometimes with state of good repair, but transit moves more passengers per hour per vehicle. You have other options, but they're not moving at that level of productivity. And transit reduces congestion. It has the ability to move more passengers efficiently, and it provides an equitable manner to move passengers. It can, provide service to all income levels and access to all age groups and access to all levels of ability. And it reduces greenhouse gases, which is really important to us. There are those who say there's no climate change. I doubt that. I would say there are significant climate changes that we're all dealing with. I mean, we're dealing with excess heat in the summer. I can't even remember what they call that thing that hit Boston. But anyway, it's something like a typhoon, but it's in the winter. I think it was a bomb blast or something, but anyway. But we're looking at, significant changes to our weather patterns. And there are concerns about public transit and what we have to do as providers. One of the issues that I think you have seen in the headlines is that public transit ridership is declining around the country, although they're not experiencing that in Canada because there's more investments in transit going on there now than we have in the United States. But they're looking at things now that they're trying to figure out as being disruptive to public transit. And those things that we're looking at are, the transportation network companies invading the market. We're looking at the changes in service delivery models that are out there now. And public transit is having to adapt to provide better service because consumer demand is actually driving those changes. We all have smartphones. I should say most of us have smartphones now. Most of us have smartphones, and those smartphones are everything to us. And I can tell you that when I can't find my smartphone, I'm in a major panic. I just can't tell you, I'm running around and looking everywhere. But being without your smartphone now is almost like being without your clothes. You can't function without having your smartphone. And so consumers are looking at, do I have the ability to make a journey with one single app and with one single pay source? And that's what they look for in terms of optimal use of public transportation these days. And so, again, the one size doesn't fit all, but these consumer changes are driving those changes in the market. Their behavior is what we all have to adapt to. And so, we're looking at also the challenges on the funding side in public transit. There's a infrastructure plan that's been put forth by the administration. On the transportation side, we all got very, very excited, but in the end, public transit actually got the short shrift. It is not in the infrastructure plan, and actually the administration was looking at ways to eliminate the capital investment grant program. And so on the advocacy side, there's been a lot of effort to ensure that the capital investment grant program, which pays for about 50% of the construction of public transit in this country, continues. We want to make sure that we continue to have these programs that support transit. Local governments have been asked to step up more to fund projects, and they have done that with these sales tax initiatives. But as Tim was saying, there are those out there who think that these public and local sales tax initiatives are a waste of money for public transit and are actively ensuring that these initiatives don't get passed. And so we in the transit industry have a significant lesson learned there from the type of advocacy and grassroots organizing that was done. And it definitely gives us a lesson of what we need to do on the transit side to ensure that these projects are funded in the future. And looking at, the issues that a lot of the legacy agencies are facing, their state of good repair in the legacy systems, because they have been basically on a starvation diet in terms of funding to provide support for making sure that their systems are reliable, that they're in a state of good repair, have created a lot of issues. You've heard about Washington, D.C., you've heard about New York. SEPTA has been doing a pretty good job with a very old system to ensure that the system is safe and reliable and as convenient as possible. But it is a challenge when you're trying to expand a system and keep a system in a state of good repair. And it both takes significant funding, and that is a challenge that many transit agencies across the country are facing now. BART in San Francisco did a very good job of going out to the public and saying, we need help. We need to ensure that our system stays in a good state of repair. They're a peer system to what Washington, D.C., and they went out and actually put on the ballot a sales tax initiative that just funds their ability to keep their system in a state of good repair. So, just looking at that transit agencies can do an effective job in a densely populated area, but have challenges when they actually have to go out and serve the suburbs and other areas, because it's not that cost effective to put frequent service out in an area where there's less population and less ridership. So the obstacles that we're facing in public transit are basically on the regulatory side, and I say that as an ex-regulator. Believe me, I had a lot of sympathy when I was at FTA, and I actually had the perspective of actually being on the operating side and understanding what regulations do. And the current administration, I think, is really focused on trying to ensure that there's less regulations, less obstacles out there, and trying to streamline the processes, and I definitely applaud them for that. And one of the biggest issues for transit agencies are the labor structures that they face. When I was in Los Angeles, I had the wonderful job of being a chief negotiator for 2 years, doing labor negotiations. And I remember when I was put on labor negotiations, I had gone to a conference and then I went on an international studies mission. I came back and my boss said, "I'm adding you to labor negotiations." And I said, "Is this a punishment for my being gone a long time?" And he said, "No, I think, with your budget background, this would be good. You will be able to, sit across the table and understand the economics of what we're negotiating." And I sat across the table with the negotiators from the union, and they said, "Do you know what 1 penny is worth?" And I said, "What does it matter? Because we're not talking pennies here. You guys are talking big bucks." And so they called me a few things, and I won't repeat what they were, but started with budget, and the last word started with a B. But anyway, we moved forward from there. But the collective bargaining agreements and the work rules, are something that transit agencies have to deal with in terms of when they want to look at innovation, look at other ways for providing service delivery. And they're usually hampered by the work rules. Some of the work rules that I had to deal with is, when we put a new service out, if the service actually duplicated any portion of an existing route, then I didn't have the option to contract it out. And contracting out new service would provide a way to reduce the costs. Also, my contract limited me to 8 lines, only 8 lines that could be contracted out to a private service provider. And we were running probably 142 lines. 8 lines wasn't going to have that significant of an impact on my cost structure, but we definitely took advantage of those 8 lines. So there are things like that that create issues for the service provider, as a transit agency, to compete with the private agencies or private providers like the TNCs to be more cost effective and innovative, because unions are about jobs and job security, and so that's what the transit agencies have to deal with. The other thing that I think is a significant issue, and people don't think about it, transit gets blamed for a lot of things, but they don't control the environment. They don't control the streets, they don't control the planning, they don't control the traffic signals, and in many cases, like when I was in Los Angeles, we didn't even control the bus stops, we controlled the sign. And so when people complain about the bus stop cleanliness, they complain about the bus stop location, that was actually a municipal responsibility. But transit, is the first line of blame, and what that does is kind of tarnish the issue and tarnish the credibility of transit when you're out there, out front, dealing with those things. So when I went to Charlotte, North Carolina, one of the things that I made sure was that I was out there telling the good story of what we did in transit, advocating for sidewalks. It was amazing. I lived in a place where people did not want sidewalks, but those sidewalks are key to accessibility as well as equity and access to transit. And so I was actually very lucky that when I was there, and Tim was talking about, being on TV, being the transit person, but I was able to actually work with our cable station, and I got 15 minutes a month that allowed me to tell a good story about what was going on, and I think that helped our image in that community. But most transit agencies don't have the opportunity that I had there. But advocacy is a big thing, and supportive transit is a big thing if we're going to combat the assault that's on the transit industry right now with these multi-million-dollar campaigns that are basically trying to kill public transit. So, talking about what's happening in your region. SEPTA is experiencing, I think, some of the same issues and challenges that you see around the country. There's there's the issue of declining ridership and, trying to restructure the bus system where it can effectively serve as well as attract ridership. A place where it's been very successful with restructuring the service was Houston, Texas. You think about Houston, you think about cars, you think about oil and gas. But what they did there was actually go out and restructure their bus system, which has attracted more riders. And they changed it from a hub and spoke system to more of a grid system. When I was in Charlotte, all the service, I should say not all, but about 80% of the service came to the downtown transit center and then went back out. So if you were trying to get from point A to point B, you had to come to downtown Charlotte, which they call Uptown. They don't call it downtown there. They call it Uptown Charlotte. Uptown Charlotte, because it's up. You have to come to Uptown Charlotte and transfer and go back out. What that does is increase the time. And now with a consumer-driven demand, time is of the essence. We all want to get things done at a quicker pace. So transit system structures have to be looked at and evaluated as to the most efficient way to get someone someplace fast. What the consumer now is looking at is their journey. How long is that journey taking, and what are the other options for the journey? And so the integration of transit, bike, ped, and other forms of transportation network companies are providing the complete journey. And so this is a region that is continuing to grow. Most urban areas are seeing growth, and so what people are looking at, and especially looking at the Amazon example, where Amazon said, we're looking for headquarters too, and one of their main criteria was, does it have access to public transit? And so I think that has been kind of a game changer that we're seeing here in the the whole transit industry, that the location of major economic drivers are dependent on public transit. And so, looking at all of the issues here, it is basically a foundation for the type of issues that we're having to deal with around the country, looking at growth, looking at productivity, and looking at serving economic development. And I have a quote here from Jeff Neupel at SEPTA, where he says, this level of growth and productivity in a densely populated area would not be possible without safe, efficient, and accessible public transportation. And he says that, SEPTA still has issues because of their aging infrastructure, but that if you don't address those issues, it definitely hurts the economic development in your region. So, what should be considered? Changes are being driven. Am I in the right place? Yes. So changes are being driven by the technological revolution, smartphones, apps, transportation network companies, shared economy, autonomous vehicles. That's all we talk about these days. We talk about ride hailing and autonomous vehicles, as I said, and that riders are looking for more. They want more amenities, they want more comfort, and they want more service. And they want their service to be integrated. And so the demand from consumers is actually looking at the ways that we change from getting from point A to point B. Because, as I said, they only want the one app, and they only want to have one pay instrument. So, what are the considerations that we have for planning better transit? I think everyone will probably say first, location is the key, but that is true. But the 3 Ds are probably more indicative and predictive of transit ridership. Density is one of the core values and core issues around transit. You can't serve with public transit well unless you're in a dense environment. And so that has been one of the challenges that we have looked at from the transit planning side, is that how do you serve the rest of the region? When I was in Charlotte, we're building out light rail, but light rail was basically serving the core city, but it wasn't serving the rest of the county. So you have to take into account what other modes of transportation are there, how can you use those effectively to serve the outlying areas and the suburbs. And what are the options for connectivity? And how do we use the right mode as the tool for the right issue here? And then land use planning and transit planning have generally, taken place separately. And somewhere we have to look at the intersection between those two, and they need to be integrated and coordinated. And I think that is one of the values of TMAC, is that they ensure that that land use planning is done in conjunction with transit planning. And, FTA, when I was working there, provided a guide for planning for transit-supported development, and is a practitioner's guide that leads agencies and developers and other interested parties into what are the resources for planning on a regional corridor at local levels, how to integrate transit-supported development and transit investment. And when I was in Charlotte, we had the 2025 plan that really looked at transit and integrated it into the land use plans there. So they addressed issues like station area development, economic centers being linked with employment, and taking into account employment locations and other areas that needed to be addressed as part of the transit and as part of the transportation land use plan. Coordinating for better transit. You need to have your funders involved, and you need to have your agencies and government and your employers. One of the challenges on the funding side is, as I said, the continuing source of federal funds and the involvement of the federal government in providing funding for the capital investment programs and funding for different discretionary grant programs like mobility, the Mobility Sandbox that looks at pilot projects across the nation to ensure that private companies are integrating with the public transit to provide journey planning. And so it's very important that we still have the federal dollars as part of our programs. And we also need to ensure that local funding is dedicated. These sales tax initiatives that have been going on across the country have been successful in the Western region. We have Los Angeles, Seattle, who've gone out and gotten public funding and ensured that they can match, from a self-help perspective, the federal funding to build out these capital projects. And so there are emerging markets around the country like Nashville, Las Vegas, and other places that are going after sales tax initiatives probably in the next year, or trying to go back out again in the future. And so we need to ensure that we're supportive of those efforts and that we advocate for that. And then the agencies and the government have to be a part of the process, and with legislation, with with legislation and supportive policies that make sure that transit can advance in the future. And employers have to think about their locations in the future. Is it accessible to transit? Are you planning for transit in the future? Are you making sure that the development has wide enough roads for buses? Does it have bus shelters? Are there bus paths there? And one of the biggest challenges providing public transportation is getting a bus into a cul-de-sac. So no cul-de-sacs. I don't think people realize that cul-de-sacs are definitely a hindrance to bringing in public transit. So mobility is one of the issues that we're facing in the suburban areas. And so how can suburban areas be better served? Mobility integration, I think, is going to be the solution in the future, although we don't have all of the answers here yet on mobility integration. But the bus service that is being provided here is probably a precursor to microtransit, which is definitely a way of serving less dense areas and providing options. So transit will continue to be the backbone, and because it serves the denser areas effectively, but it's a service that works very well in the core of the city, but it's a different delivery challenge when you're out in the suburbs. And traditional service vehicles, timetables, and accessibility are different challenges when you're in the suburbs. So to address those needs, transit agencies are looking at ways that they can partner and integrate with the TNCs, the transportation network companies like Uber and Lyft, and look at ways that they can access funding for these programs. There's pilot programs going on around the country, and to do those, they also need seed money to see and test whether or not those are going to be good options for the future. And so FTA has actually implemented a mobility on-demand sandbox, and they're providing grants to integrate the mobile and the mobility apps to provide alternatives to the personal car. Uber and Lyft, they will tell you that they don't see transit as their competition, they see the personal car as their competition. And I think the same thing from the transit side. We can't see them as the competition. We're all trying to remove people from single cars and improve the environment with transportation options that will serve more effectively. So the trends on the horizon are all of these, all of the above. So we see transportation network companies, ride-hailing services, Uber and Lyft. I have their app. I can tell you that, I lived in Washington, D.C. for over 2 years. Before I left Charlotte, North Carolina, I was in a car accident and my car was totaled. And so I said, I'm moving to D.C. Do I want to deal with public transit, or do I want to have my own car? I chose public transit. I had a Zipcar membership. I had a Metro Pass for work commuting that was given to me by my employer, the federal government. I had a personal pass. I had taxis. I had Uber. I had Lyft. And of course, I have all of these as apps on my phone. I want the one app too. And I had walking and bike share. And so I lived 2 years very happily without a car. And then I moved to a transit desert outside of Las Vegas. And now I need a car again. And so For those who can avail themselves of all of these options, you have a way of completing your journey. And so what is facing public transit is not to be obsolete and not to be out of sync with the consumer demand. And so they are looking at all of these. And so we're looking at basically what is happening in public transit. You see integration with transportation network companies. You see car sharing services out there which have not been integrated yet. But in some cases, I think public transit is looking at whether or not they should have like car sharing using their park and ride lots. And you see the implementation of microtransit throughout the region. The most recent implementations of microtransit have been in Arlington, Texas, which is one of the largest cities in the country that doesn't have public transit. It's between Dallas and Fort Worth. And so they were not in the reach of either of those systems, and now they've implemented their on-demand shuttle service around the city. And then in Altamont Springs, Florida, they've looked at 5 cities there sharing Uber as a way to get transportation between those cities and actually subsidizing those rides. So there's options out there for where public transit isn't viable, but then there's also options for public transit to be more viable with the integration of some of these different services. And then there's autonomous vehicles. That's out there. I won't say it's a solution yet, but it's one that everybody is looking at. They think that autonomous vehicles is going to be a replacement for public transit. I doubt that it will be a replacement, but it will be probably complementary or supplement public transit, because it just doesn't have the level of productivity that you get from public transit. On average, you can get 16 people to 40-something people on public transit, and in autonomous cars, you might get 2 or 3, but they're also looking at autonomous buses and autonomous trains. On the train side, autonomous vehicles basically already exist, but in some cases, labor has said you will not run these, so you have a person sitting there with an autonomous vehicle. And so autonomous vehicles can kind of replicate public transit with platooning or fleets, but you still have people in separate vehicles. And then the last thing that is on the horizon is mobility as a service, Maas as we call it. And that is the solution that the consumers are looking for, because it is the integration of different transit services as well as different transit pay or PayPal and other payment, or Apple Pay, different payment areas that can be integrated into one solution. And so, looking at the value that public transit serves, in contrast, this is what TNCs offer. First of all, the big thing here is choice, and the consumers are looking for that, and they're looking for alternatives. And so what we're seeing is a change in behavior, and that behavior is one that's driving the market. And so we have to be responsive as providers to that changing behavior. And most importantly, it has the ability to actually complement public transit. And so I think that is the lesson that we have to learn here in public transit is we're not competing. We need to look at how we can work together. And there are places that public transit hasn't been that effective. First and last mile, providing services there. When there's a service disruption, these TNCs can actually step in and get people home. And I experienced that. My first day at FTA was the day that the WMATA system actually had a major accident. And I'm standing there and saying, how am I going to get home? I got home with Uber. Of course, the surge demand pricing was out of the world. A $7 ride became a $31 ride because there was that much demand, because the system, the whole network was down. And then late night service. It provides employers an option to get their workers home, and it provides all those who are out there drinking a way to get home, which sometimes public transit doesn't operate up to the times that the bars close, because public transit has to take time to actually maintain itself. And that window to maintain itself is usually from 1 to 4. And that people don't realize that that time is so critical to actually keeping a transit system in a state of good repair. And those transit systems that have tried to edge more and more toward the service side, like Washington, D.C. did at one point, actually gave up their ability to keep their system in a state of good repair, because they gave up their maintenance and track time. And so this is a very good option for that issue that public transit faces. And the other one is reduced demand for parking. And that's also what autonomous vehicles are also saying that they can have as a benefit in the future too, because you're getting dropped off rather than actually having to go into a parking lot. And I was talking this morning with John and saying that when I go to downtown Los Angeles, I have to pay $40 a day to park at our office. And I was thinking that it might be cheaper for me to do a round trip on Uber than pay that $40. And so, you know, to do without the parking. And that's one of the big costs of working in an urban environment. And as I said, you know, the opportunities for transit and the new mobility to integrate are around you know, first and last mile services, providing suburban service solutions, paratransit service, you know, providing service to those who need service for disabilities, dialysis and other things like that is very costly for a transit agency. It's usually probably sometimes 10 times more expensive to transport a disabled rider using the paratransit services than it is on our fixed route services. So looking at options for more cost-effective solutions, these transit network companies may also be a good spot for that in the market. And as I said, you know, when service is disrupted, providing guaranteed ride home, and that's really also key too if you're working late. As some companies will actually provide those services if you're working late. And you know, just basically dealing with the issues around demand and congestion and getting to remote job sites. There are a lot of companies that will locate in remote office parks, and then their workers are then challenged with, how do I get there and how do I get home? And so it's a solution for that also. And microtransit also has the same benefits. It does provide on-demand service. It's a little bit of like your bus service here, but you can actually call for the service or go on an app, and the route will be deviated to come and pick you up at your door. And so that is one of the features that a lot of people are looking at now. And as I said, in Arlington, Texas, it's being piloted. So we'll keep our eyes on that to see where that goes in the future. So I said, what is the future? The future is mobility as a service, because the consumers are going to demand that, and that's what they want. And if we're going to be able to be responsive, we'll have to be able to provide those services. And consumers are now not planning a trip or a segment of a trip, they want to plan a journey. And so mobility as a service is part of that solution to journey planning. It provides a way to aggregate and integrate all of the apps. And it also provides a one-stop payment place that consumers can use. So it's being piloted very effectively in Europe, in Finland, in Scotland, in Vienna. And it's something that we're going to be talking about here in the United States and Canada as we've talked about these mobility symposiums and mobility summits that we're having. We've seen that this is what transit has to do if they're going to stay viable in the future. And these are just kind of a list of questions, closing out here. Things that you should ask yourself as you're planning development in your region, as you look at the direction that you want transportation to go. There's no one answer. There's diverse environments, but these are the type of things that we should be asking ourselves as we move forward. Are we going to have connectivity? Are we going to grow market in the region? How do we address the needs of our riders? Can transit be involved with Maas? There are different options there. Maas could actually be provided by the private sector. It could be provided by municipalities, or it could be provided by transit. So it's who gets in the game first. And Uber and Lyft are already there, because they're taking their apps and now putting more applications on them in terms of options. And so if transit is going to get engaged, they got to get moving. And and looking at ways to fill the gaps and how to work regionally. And when you're planning, transit options, are you thinking about the connectivity? But if you're also a developer, are you thinking about transit? So, thank you. I appreciate the time.